Alrighty, hi everyone. To introduce myself, my name is Jake. I'm a first year here at Carolina, so the class of 2024. I'm majoring in anthropology and American Indian slash Indigenous Studies with a minor in Russian language and culture. And my global experiences is before coming to Carolina, I took a gap year through UNC's Global Gap Year Fellowship Program. During that time, I spent 3 months in Cuba, 3 months in Navajo Nation, as well as did some travel to Mexico, Mi'kmaq, which is my indigenous homeland, Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Israel. So moving into our first topic today, we're going to be talking a bit about politics in Cuba, which I call the land of upheaval because Cuba is quite a land of upheaval historically and politically. Our focus questions, which just to stay on track with time, I'm going to read them off at once and then probably answer them pretty quickly. So some good things to know about the Cuban government is who is its leader, how many political parties are there, and how long has the current system existed for? And when I ask who its leader is, I'm sure a lot of you think Fidel Castro or perhaps Raul Castro. Fidel Castro passed away a few years ago, and his brother was president of the country until a few years ago, after which he became president of the Communist Party, which is the only political party allowed in Cuba. But the current president is some new blood, someone born after the revolution, named Miguel Diaz-Canel, and the current system has existed since 1959. The current president was born in 1960, so it's very much a switch over to younger leadership for the country. The ideals of Cuban governance are largely based on the ideas of Jose Marti, who was a Cuban poet and patriot in the early to mid 1900s. So a lot of their philosophies are actually based on his ideologies that came from a lot before the Cuban Revolution, as well as the people's democracy is the founding idea behind the country rather than our idea of a Western or liberal democracy. In addition to that, Cuba is a Marxist-Leninist socialist state. One of the large reasons for this is while they were left-leaning after the revolution, they got a lot of support from the Soviet Union and not a lot of support from the US. And so they really became entrenched in this Soviet political ideology and the idea of revolutionary equality. And a quote down there from the Cuban Constitution, which was passed in 1940 and edited in 1976 to include this, is the CCP, or Cuban Communist Party, is the leading force of society and of the state. A little information here, and just to let all of you know, I have some notes on a second monitor right next to me, so if I'm looking away from the camera, that's why. A little bit on Cuban elections and governmental structure. There are three branches, much like the United States: the executive, the legislative, and the judicial. Anyone over 16 years old can vote, but it is a one-party state. So you can vote for whoever you want. They have to be either a member of the Communist Party or they have to be unaffiliated. However, it doesn't work like the US does in that it's a lot more grassroots. So that's meaning that, for example, if I live in a town, I can vote for my municipal assembly, and then my municipal representative will go on to vote for the provincial assembly, who will go on to vote for the national assembly. So it isn't like the US in that people don't vote for their national representatives, for example, but they see themselves as more democratic than the US actually, because they vote for people from the bottom up rather than from the bottom all the way to immediately to the top. A bit about the Cuban executive branch. It was originally headed by a prime minister, but that became president. And the most famous president of Cuba is, of course, Fidel Castro. Both the first president, Fidel Castro, and his brother, Raul, were obviously members of the same family and fighters in the Cuban Revolution. The leader is both president and typically head of the Communist Party because the executive branch and the party are one and the same, being that it's a one-party state. Um, so this leader is appointed, in the modern day at least, this leader is appointed by the National Council and by the Cuban Communist Party. And you see on the bottom right there is a photo of Raul Castro on the right, holding up the arm of Miguel Diaz-Canel, who's the current president, representing the transition of power from the Revolutionary Guard to the new generations. So the legislature in Cuba is La Asamblea Nacional del Poder Popular, And there are 605 representatives in the assembly, all of whom belong to the Cuban Communist Party. They're elected for 5-year terms, although they can be removed after 2.5 years by election by the provincial assemblies. They decide things like the constitutionality of laws. They can edit the constitution. Last time they did was in 2019. You see on the bottom right is their Capitol building called El Capitolio, which is actually modeled after the US Capitol building. And should you ever find yourself in Havana, it is right in the center of the city. You can't miss it. No matter where you are in Havana, you'll see it on the skyline. And so while the assembly, the People's Popular Assembly has been 605 representatives since it was founded after the revolution, in 2019, they voted to reduce to a 474 member assembly, which will come into effect after the 2023 general election. And the assembly, of course, decides who will be in the executive branch as well. That includes the Council of State, which has one president, one head vice president, 5 other vice presidents, and 23 members. The Cuban judicial system, it originally started with the Supreme Court of Cuba, which existed from 1898 to 1973 and was largely based on the US's system because Cuba was a US protectorate for several decades in the 1900s. From 1973 to present, it's been the Tribunal Supremo Popular, or the People's Supreme Court. So the way that it works is misdemeanors come with fines or under 1 year in jail, and then felonies can be over 1 year in jail. What we think of as felonies versus misdemeanors are pretty different in the US and Cuba. For example, you could go to jail for several years in Cuba for drug use, whereas in most of the US, recreational drugs like cannabis have been decriminalized or even legalized in a lot of states. The way that fines work is they have something called a quota, which is like a percentage of your income. So rather than everyone paying the same fine, if you commit a misdemeanor, then your fine is determined by how much money you make. It's a certain percentage of your income, not a large percentage. The way that lawyers work is there's bufetos colectivos, which are collective law offices, similar to pro bono lawyers in the US. And one of the reasons that the Cuban judicial system is criticized a lot abroad is because every Cuban courtroom has a judge, 2 lay judges, government representatives, and these bufetos colectivos, the collective lawyers. And there's no jury, there's no trial by jury, nothing of that sort. It's all decided by legal and governmental experts, which can, of course, lead to corruption. The most powerful branch of the Cuban government is Las Fuerzas Armadas Revolucionarias, or the Cuban Revolutionary Armed Forces. So they're responsible both for keeping the peace in Cuba and for doing things like guarding monuments, as you see at the bottom there. In addition to that, they were really essential in Cuba's early history. For example, they fought against the US when the US invaded Cuba in 1961 at the Bay of Pigs. They've been known for sending troops abroad, for example, to Angola, to Vietnam, revolutions and civil wars across the world. They will send troops to support the leftist or communist parties of it. For example, you see in the top right there is Cuban and Venezuelan forces marching together. One thing that Cuba is known for across the world, especially during the COVID crisis, is its so-called medical brigades. So Cuba sends doctors abroad free of charge to various crisis locations. Cuba's doctors are famously underpaid, but famously overqualified. And so they've been sent all over the world to different crises. And that really improves Cuba's reputation abroad, as well as the reputation of their governmental system. They're often criticized for having poor medical care on the ground at home in Cuba while sending so many doctors abroad, but this is a really essential part of their kind of, their medical brigades are a really big part of their identity. And you see in the bottom right is a photo showing all the different countries that received Cuban doctors during the COVID crisis. In addition to that, this is a way of Cuban diplomacy. For example, after Hurricane Katrina, Cuba wanted to send a lot of doctors to the United States, but the United States refused to receive the help from our southern neighbor. Lastly, of course, Cuba is often known for civil unrest and violation of human rights. Global human rights organizations say that the Cuban government, and especially its judicial system, are incredibly opaque. There's arbitrary charges and unfair judicial trials of political opponents, limited rights and to political and civil expression, um, controlled media with government censorship, and suppression of minority identities. Examples of this is practicing any religion at all was not legal in Cuba until the late 1990s, after the fall of the Soviet Union, when the country started moving towards more socialist rather than communist, a bit more centrist. In addition to that, any newspaper that you buy in the country is state-sponsored and state-censored. You see some examples of protest there. On the lower left is the Cuban women in white who protest every day in Havana for greater civil expression and free speech. In the middle is a gay pride parade, which the Cuban government had approved of in the past, but in 2019 said that it couldn't happen because they didn't have the proper permits. And the LGBTQ community of Havana decided to go ahead and do it anyways. And that's been one of very, very few examples of open political protest against government wishes in Cuba in recent years. And then on the bottom right was just a few months ago, the San Isidro movement, which has been a movement of artists and musicians to have greater freedom of expression in Cuba. And the government broke up that protest pretty quickly, saying that it was breaking COVID guidelines, although it made news around the world and certainly is changing things in Cuba. So a couple of things I see it's 1:20, so I'll say things to think about rather than to discuss. Firstly, the difference between popular democracy and liberal democracy, because Cuba sees itself as a popular democracy. They see themselves as more democratic than the United States, although we see it as less so because they vote every level up rather than voting for everyone in power the way that we do. Another thing to think of is, does the Cuban government really see itself as democratic, or are they just putting this facade on for the rest of the world? Another thing is, in Cuba, 16-year-olds can vote, whereas in the United States, obviously they can't. I'm sure some of you that are in high school reading this would think, wow, I would love to vote at 16. Those of you in middle school will be 16 soon enough. And so that's a big difference from the US. Another thing to think of is, should the US lift its trade embargo against Cuba to allow greater flow of information and even democracy to Cuba? Lastly, what can Cuba learn from other countries, and what can we learn from Cuba?
Good. Thank you, Jake. Those are all good questions. And again, if you're watching this after the fact, you can always pause and discuss these more with your students before you go on.